What if I told you the biggest threat from the Middle East war is not oil, not gas, and not even the Strait of Hormuz itself? What if the real crisis is global food production? Because right now, while most of the world is focused on missiles, warships, and oil prices, something much bigger is quietly happening underneath the surface. The global agricultural system is starting to break, and according to warnings from inside the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the damage for 2025 and even 2026 may already be locked in. This is not another Ukraine-style supply shock. This is something very different, and potentially much worse. Today we're going to break down why the Hormuz crisis could become a global food crisis, why markets may be completely misreading the scale of the danger, why fertilizer matters more than oil, why farmers around the world are already changing behavior, and why the next major inflation wave may come from food, not energy. Because the real story here is not what's exploding today, it's what stops growing tomorrow. Let's start with the biggest misconception. Most people are comparing this crisis to the Ukraine war in 2022. That comparison is understandable, but it's wrong. Ukraine disrupted grain exports. That was a downstream supply shock. The world lost wheat exports from one of the largest agricultural producers on Earth. Prices surged, markets panicked, governments scrambled. But there was still a solution. Other countries could plant more. Brazil increased output. The United States increased output. Australia increased output. Within a few seasons, the system partially stabilized. Hormuz is completely different, because this time the disruption is not hitting food directly. It is hitting the industrial inputs that make modern agriculture possible in the first place. That distinction changes everything. Most people think food comes from farms. In reality, modern food comes from energy. Natural gas creates fertilizer, oil powers tractors, diesel powers irrigation systems, shipping moves inputs across continents, sulfur supports fertilizer production, cold chain logistics preserve food, packaging depends on petrochemicals. The entire global food system is effectively built on hydrocarbons. And that is why the Strait of Hormuz matters so much. Because Hormuz is not just an oil choke point, it is one of the central arteries of the industrial global economy. Roughly 35% of globally traded crude oil, 20% of natural gas, up to 30% of fertilizer flows, and around half of global sulfur exports move through this region. Now think about what happens when that system breaks, not for a few days, but for months. This is where the story becomes genuinely dangerous. Inside the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, economists are focused on the 90-day crop calendar threshold. This is the point where disruption to planting cycles starts becoming irreversible. At the time of the discussion, the world was already around day 75, meaning the window for avoiding yield destruction is rapidly closing. And this is where many people misunderstand how agriculture works. Agriculture does not operate on financial market time. You cannot simply turn production back on. Farmers make decisions months in advance: what to plant, how much fertilizer to apply, whether irrigation is economically viable, and whether crops are worth the risk at all. And those decisions are already changing. But there is another issue which may be the single most important part of the entire story. Natural gas is not just fuel, it is the feedstock for ammonia. Ammonia creates nitrogen fertilizer. Nitrogen fertilizer drives crop yields. So when gas prices explode, fertilizer prices explode, and when fertilizer becomes too expensive, farmers use less of it. That is exactly what is now happening globally. The consequence is not immediate famine. The consequence is lower yields months later. And this is why the market may be underestimating the scale of the coming inflation wave. Because energy shocks today become food shocks tomorrow. Also, farmers are already changing behavior. This process has already started. Farmers are responding rationally. If fertilizer becomes too expensive, they reduce application. If diesel becomes too expensive, they plant less acreage. If weather conditions deteriorate, they switch crops. And we are already seeing signs of this. In the United States, there are early indications that farmers are rotating away from corn towards soybeans. That sounds technical, but it matters enormously. Corn is fertilizer-intensive, soybeans require less nitrogen, soy is safer in a high-cost environment. But if enough farmers make that shift, corn supplies tighten, livestock feed costs rise, meat prices increase, and food inflation spreads through the economy. Again, the consequences arrive later. That delay is what makes this crisis so deceptive. Now add another layer: El Niño. The Food and Agriculture Organization is deeply concerned that reduced irrigation and lower fertilizer usage may collide with severe weather stress. That creates a compounding system. Not one shock. Multiple shocks reinforcing each other simultaneously: higher energy prices, lower fertilizer use, reduced irrigation, shipping disruption, extreme weather. This is where systems stop behaving linearly. And once agricultural systems become non-linear, governments lose control very quickly. Europe may be one of the most exposed regions in this scenario. Why? Because Europe no longer has Russian pipeline gas as a shock absorber. The continent now depends far more heavily on LNG imports. That means Europe is increasingly exposed to LNG shipping disruption, Asian competition, and elevated prices. And remember, high gas prices feed directly into fertilizer costs. During the previous gas crisis, large parts of Europe's fertilizer industry became uneconomic. That risk is returning. And unlike 2022, governments now have less fiscal flexibility and far more political fatigue. China is in a much stronger position than most countries. Why? Because China still has access to Russian hydrocarbons, large strategic reserves, and state-directed systems. But China's resilience creates another problem. Every shipment redirected toward China is one less available to Europe or global markets. India is another critical variable. If India begins restricting rice exports, the global food market changes overnight, and governments know this. This is why many countries are moving towards strategic stockpiling, resource nationalism, and defensive procurement. The globalization era of just-in-time food systems is starting to crack. What about the stagflation risk? This is where the story becomes macroeconomic. The danger here is not simply inflation, it is stagflation, high inflation, weak growth, persistent supply stress. That combination is extremely difficult for central banks to manage. And unlike a normal recession, food inflation is politically explosive. Governments can tolerate high asset prices. They can tolerate weak tech stocks. They cannot tolerate populations struggling to afford food. That is when subsidies rise, export restrictions appear, fiscal deficits expand, and commodity markets become even more distorted. Why markets may still be underestimating this? I think markets are still largely treating this as a temporary Middle East disruption, but this increasingly looks like a structural reset in the global food and energy system. Because even if Hormuz partially reopens tomorrow, the crop calendar does not reset. You cannot suddenly recover fertilizer that was never applied. You cannot recover acreage that was never planted. You cannot rebuild lost yields instantly. And you definitely cannot build replacement LNG terminals, fertilizer plants, or shipping infrastructure in a few months. Those are multi-year systems. That means the economic effects may continue feeding through well into 2026. The real danger here is that by the time the world fully realizes this is a food crisis, the agricultural decisions will already have been made, and that may be the most important thing to understand about the Hormuz shock. The missiles matter, the tankers matter, the oil market matters. But the real story may ultimately be much simpler. When energy systems break, food systems break shortly after. And right now, the world may be entering the early stages of exactly that process. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more deep-dive geopolitical and energy analysis. And let me know in the comments, do you think markets are underestimating the food inflation risk from Hormuz?